what was it you think that drove you to this idea specifically? Because this is, although you are making yourself vulnerable, this is not an autobiography. You, to the best of my knowledge, have not been in a school shooting.
Correct.
And I don't think you had anybody die of a congenital heart issue either.
No, both of those things are fictionalized. It's funny because one of the early publishers who rejected the book said, you know, I don't get the mime class. Like, why on earth would you choose a mime class? And the irony was that's the only part of the book that is autobiographical. You know, because I guess her thing, she said, she was like, I don't buy it. Nobody would take a mime class. And the irony was that everything else was fiction. That was the one thing that was actually true. Although I am very fortunate to not have had either of those traumatic experiences of either surviving a mass shooting or of losing a close family member to a heart disease, I did have an incident of trauma in high school where I was physically attacked. And I think I drew from my experience of trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder to sort of breathe some life and some realistic experiences into the characters in the book, and was able to sort of draw on that without even realizing it for a long time. It took me a while to figure out where the ideas were coming from. I mean, I think there's a whole interesting area to be explored of our subconscious and where ideas for writing comes, and the intersection between writing and psychology and our own, you know, working out our own issues. And it certainly took me longer than I now in hindsight can imagine to figure out how much of this book was personal for me, even though it was not directly related to experiences I had. And I think I sort of figured that out as another thing that an editor really took issue with and decided not to buy the book because of, was that when Lucy meets all of the kids at her new middle school, they instantly say to her, you know, I was here on the day of the school shooting. This is what happened to me. This is where I was, and I lost this person. And, you know, one after another, they're very forthcoming about their trauma and their grief with her. And one editor just said, that's not how it works. That's not realistic. And that was the moment I realized that was the autobiographical part for me. I went through a part of my trauma healing process where after a few years of shoving it down and pretending it didn't happen, I was finally dealing with it. I was in therapy. I was working on it. And part of that process for me, which I learned is actually very common trauma response for some people, is going through a phase where you want to disclose your trauma to everybody you meet. And in my early 20s, if you met me in New York, I'd be like, hi, I'm Emily. Let me tell you about this crazy thing that happened to me. Just get this out of the way and let me tell you the whole story. And thank goodness that phase didn't last very long. And I apologize to everyone I met in my early 20s who had to hear my story. But that was a very personal part of my journey that made its way into the story before I even really realized where that came from. And it was in sort of defending that to an editor that I realized, oh, no, this is part of my story. And that's when I started realizing that this book was so much more personal for me than I had originally realized.
I find, and this is probably just the Hoosierness within me speaking, but I prefer, I'm annoyed when I'm writing something and I spot that my direct personal connection. I prefer that I be blind to it until afterwards, because I know it's going to be there and I'm going to find it, and I'm going to have where I go, oh, that was crying out to be said, and now I've said it and I see it. But after I finish the story, because if I start thinking about it while I'm in the story, then I'm going to start shaping it around. It's going to become therapy with Rob rather than let's tell the fun story.
Exactly. I do think I think there was a self-protective part of my brain that, you know, purposefully did not want to connect to some of this stuff until I was finished writing it. And that's exactly how it worked, because it isn't about me. And there is that funny line of being a writer where, of course, everything you write is personal and everything is in some way about you because it all is coming from your brain. But in another way, you know, this story is not about me, and I've been very honest with that. And also it was really important to me in publishing this book and telling this story from day one. I've always felt strongly that I'm donating a portion of my proceeds to gun violence prevention advocacy organizations, because this isn't my story to tell. And I want to be very clear and careful about recognizing the people who are directly affected by this and drawing attention where it deserves, and making this book part of the solution and not just putting it out there and leaving people hanging. So it was important to me to be very clear that, no, this is not my story. But at the same time, there are definitely elements of it that are incredibly personal to me. And I think that's what makes it relatable, I hope, to the reader, is that you can pick up this book, and even if it's not your story either, you can relate to hopefully more than one of the characters. And it's another reason why Lucy, the main character, is very, very specifically and intentionally an outsider coming into this situation of trauma survivors. Now, the fact that she has her own separate trauma is, of course, a different issue. But in terms of the sort of the school shooting trauma, she is entering this situation as an outsider, which I think, I hope, makes a very helpful proxy for readers coming into it who are statistically likely to also be outsiders to this experience. And it just gives them an entryway to hear the story and experience it alongside Lucy, who wasn't there and didn't experience it herself either.